Lieutenant James Kovac had been serving aboard the ISS Meridian for 6 months, long enough to learn that every species had unwritten rules more important than the official protocols, and violating them could turn routine days into diplomatic incidents. The Meridian was humanity's most ambitious deep space exploration vessel, crewed by multiple species pushing farther into uncharted space than anyone had dared before. James had learned to navigate the social complexity, Tellarians with their obsessive precision and inability to understand metaphor, Vorians with their communal decision-making that turned simple conversations into town hall meetings, and the Kyrath, the proud warrior species whose reputation for emotional control and martial excellence made them simultaneously respected and slightly feared by the rest of the crew. The Kyrath believed emotions were dangerous, evolutionary artifacts that needed to be mastered and disciplined into useful tools. A Kyrath warrior experiencing anger would acknowledge it, channel it into combat focus, then dismiss it completely once its utility ended. Fear was information to be processed and acted upon, not felt. Joy was a brief chemical reward to be noted and released. James had worked alongside Kyrath crew members before, admired their effectiveness, and learned to interpret their controlled body language since their faces rarely showed anything beyond professional neutrality. But he'd never worked closely with Commander Vera, the Kyrath security chief whose reputation preceded her like a warning signal. She was striking in the way all Kyrath were, nearly 7 feet tall with a powerful build that suggested she could break most species in half without much effort. Her skin had the characteristic silver-gray tone of her people, marked with darker patterns that indicated military rank and combat honors. Her ears swept back from her skull like elegant wings, mobile and expressive in ways that contradicted her otherwise controlled demeanor. She'd been aboard the Meridian for 2 years, longer than almost any other crew member, and was known for her cold efficiency and minimal tolerance for what she called emotional excess, by which she meant normal human behavior. James had managed to avoid any significant interaction with Vera until the training simulation went catastrophically wrong. The combat deck had been running a boarding scenario, hostile forces attempting to breach the ship, crew responding with coordinated defense. It was routine practice, the kind of drill they ran monthly to maintain readiness. James was positioned near the primary access point, coordinating human and Kyrath security teams through his tactical display, when the simulation's safety protocols failed in a cascade that would trigger an investigation later. The artificial gravity cut out without warning. One moment James was standing normally, the next he was floating in 0G as emergency alarms screamed and equipment began drifting in dangerous trajectories. His training kicked in immediately. Secure yourself, assist others, prevent collisions with critical systems. He reached out instinctively, his hand catching Vera's arm as she floated past, pulling her away from a weapons rack that would have caused serious injury if she'd collided with it at her current velocity. He was still processing the successful intervention when Vera's voice cut through the chaos like a plasma blade, loud enough to carry across the entire deck despite the alarms. "Get your hands off me, human." The words weren't shouted but somehow worse, precisely enunciated, cold with fury, carrying an unmistakable threat. Every head turned. The Kyrath crew members froze in whatever they'd been doing. Even the Tellarians, who generally didn't care about interpersonal drama, paused their emergency procedures. James released Vera's arm like it had burned him, hands raised in automatic apology. "I was just the weapons rack. You were about to." But Vera was already pushing away from him, using a bulkhead to propel herself toward the exit with the practiced grace of someone completely comfortable in 0G. Her expression was the controlled mask that Kyrath wore when fury was being systematically suppressed and channeled, which somehow made it more intimidating than visible anger. She didn't look back. Gravity returned 30 seconds later with a mechanical thud, and James landed awkwardly, his knees buckling slightly. The simulation ended, declared void due to technical malfunction, and crew members dispersed with the mix of relief and disappointment that came from interrupted training. But several people were staring at James with expressions ranging from sympathy to something like horror. Petty Officer Chen, one of the human tactical specialists, approached with the careful demeanor of someone delivering bad news. "Sir, you know you just committed a serious violation of Kyrath cultural protocol, right?" James felt his stomach drop. "I was preventing her from getting injured. It was an emergency response." "Sure, from a human perspective. From a Kyrath perspective, you invaded her personal sovereignty without permission. Physical contact without invitation is considered." Chen paused, searching for the right words, "basically an assault on their autonomy. It implies they can't control their own body, which is one of the worst insults you can give a Kyrath warrior. But it was an emergency. She was about to hit the weapons rack. Did you warn her verbally first? Give her the chance to correct her trajectory herself?" James replayed the moment in his head and realized he hadn't. He'd simply acted on human instinct. See someone in danger, help immediately, sort out the details later. It had seemed like common sense, basic decency, the obvious response. He hadn't considered that Vera's culture would interpret helpful intervention as offensive presumption. Chen's expression was sympathetic. "Look, your intentions were good, everyone knows that. But intentions don't always matter when you cross cultural lines. The Kyrath are really serious about this stuff. You might want to file a formal apology through proper diplomatic channels before this becomes a bigger problem." James spent the rest of his shift feeling the weight of stares from Kyrath crew members who'd witnessed the incident. None of them spoke to him directly, but their body language, ears tilted back, postures carefully neutral, communicated clear disapproval. His human colleagues tried to be supportive, reassuring him that anyone would have done the same thing, that Kyrath cultural protocols were unreasonably rigid, that Vera should have understood his intentions. But their words didn't help much when James kept replaying the moment, Vera's voice echoing in his memory. "Get your hands off me, human." He'd served on multi-species crews for 5 years, prided himself on his cultural sensitivity, studied the basics of Kyrath social structures. And he'd still managed to commit a serious offense through simple human instinct. It was exhausting, trying to remember that what felt like basic decency to one species could be profound disrespect to another. By the end of his shift, James was exhausted from stress rather than actual work. He retreated to his quarters, planning to draft a formal apology and submit it through the proper diplomatic channels, maybe request a meeting with the Kyrath cultural liaison to better understand what he'd done wrong. He was composing the first paragraph when his communication console chimed with an incoming private message. The sender was Commander Vera. James's finger hovered over the accept button, his heart rate increasing with anxiety. Whatever this message contained, it wouldn't be pleasant. He accepted it and text appeared on his screen. No video, just words in the precise, formal style that Kyrath used for official communication. "Lieutenant Kovac, report to my quarters at 2100 hours. Come alone. This matter requires private resolution. Do not discuss this summons with other crew members. Confirm receipt." James read it 3 times, trying to decode the subtext. Private resolution could mean anything. Was she planning to formally reprimand him away from official channels? Challenge him to some kind of Kyrath honor combat? Simply berate him in private for his cultural ignorance? He had no idea, but the message's tone was absolutely clear. This wasn't optional, and he wasn't to tell anyone where he was going. He confirmed receipt with a simple "understood. Will comply." Then he sat staring at his console, trying to calm the anxiety spiraling through his chest. 2 hours until 2100. 2 hours to imagine every possible scenario, most of them unpleasant. James used the time to research Kyrath cultural protocols around personal violations, hoping to better understand the severity of his offense and what private resolution might entail. What he found wasn't encouraging. Physical contact without explicit permission was indeed considered a serious violation among Kirath, not quite as severe as physical assault, but not far below it. The offense wasn't about the contact itself, but what it implied. That the recipient couldn't control their own body or situation, that they needed outside intervention, that they were weak or incompetent. For a warrior species that prided itself on perfect emotional and physical discipline, such implications struck at the core of their identity. Traditional Kirath resolution for such violations involved formal apology rituals with specific phrasing and gesture requirements, sometimes accompanied by symbolic compensation. More serious violations could escalate to honor challenges or formal marks against one's record. James hoped that whatever Vera had planned fell into the formal apology category, though the private nature of the summons suggested something outside standard protocols. At 20:55, James left his quarters and made his way through the ship's corridors toward the officer housing section, where senior crew maintained private quarters. The Meridian operated on a roughly Earth-standard day-night cycle, and at this hour, the corridors were quiet, lighting dim to encourage rest for off-duty crew. He passed a few Tellarians conducting their evening precision rituals, and one human ensign who nodded a greeting without speaking. Vera's quarters were in the section reserved for department heads, more spacious than standard crew accommodations, but still modest by civilian standards. James arrived at precisely 2100, his military punctuality the only thing he felt confident about in this situation. He stood before the door for 3 seconds, gathering himself, then pressed the announce button. The door opened immediately, before the chime could even sound, suggesting Vera had been waiting. She stood in the doorway, blocking his view of the interior, and James found himself looking up slightly to meet her eyes. She'd changed from her uniform into something more casual, dark-fitted clothing that still suggested military discipline, but without the formal markers of rank. Her ears were tilted slightly forward, a position he didn't know how to interpret. Enter. Not an invitation, a command. She stepped aside just enough to let him pass, and James walked into her quarters, hearing the door seal behind him with a soft hiss that felt oddly final. Vera's quarters were exactly what he would have expected if asked to imagine them. Spare and organized with geometric precision, everything in its designated place. One wall displayed weapons, ceremonial blades and what looked like training equipment, arranged with careful attention to aesthetic balance. A meditation space occupied one corner, marked by a mat and small altar holding objects whose significance James didn't understand. The sleeping area was separated by a partial divider, visible but private. No decorations, no personal items that didn't serve a purpose, nothing frivolous or merely comfortable. James stood awkwardly in the center of the main room, while Vera moved past him to stand near the viewport that showed the starfield beyond. She seemed to be gathering herself, and he waited, following the basic protocol of letting her speak first since he was the one who'd caused offense. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was still that controlled Kirath neutrality, but something in her posture had shifted. "Lieutenant Kovac, I did not summon you here to continue the conflict from earlier today." James felt a small measure of relief, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "Commander, I want to apologize for—" She raised one hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Your apology is noted, but not why I asked you here. I have a different matter to discuss, one that requires your cooperation and discretion." James waited, genuinely confused now about where this was going. Vera seemed to be choosing her words with unusual care, which was notable for a species that always spoke with precision. "I am conducting research into human emotional processing. Specifically, I am attempting to understand how your species functions effectively in high-stress situations despite your lack of emotional discipline." This has been my personal research project throughout my assignment on this vessel. Whatever James had been expecting, it wasn't this. I'm not sure I understand, Commander. Kyrath culture views emotional control as essential to effective operation. We master our feelings, channel them into useful purposes, then dismiss them. Your species does not do this. Humans experience emotions continuously, allow them to influence your decisions, display them openly, and somehow remain functional. This is a paradox I have been attempting to understand through observation. James still wasn't sure where this was going. That's an interesting research topic, Commander. Observation has proven insufficient. I can see emotional reactions but cannot comprehend the internal experience that drives human behavior. I need a different approach. Vera paused, and James noticed her hands were clasped behind her back in a way that suggested tension despite her controlled voice. Kyrath neurology includes specialized empathic receptors that allow limited emotional connection through direct physical contact. This capability is rarely used in our culture, reserved for specific medical or ceremonial purposes. But it would allow me to experience human emotional processing directly rather than observing it from outside. James felt his pulse quicken as he realized what she was suggesting. You want to use this empathic connection on me to feel what I feel? Yes, with your consent. Vera's ears tilted slightly downward, a position that conveyed something like uncertainty. I understand this is an unusual request, particularly given today's incident. If you refuse, I will accept that decision and we will not speak of this again. But I am asking because you demonstrated something during the gravity failure that I need to understand. Immediate instinct to assist despite personal risk, driven entirely by emotional impulse rather than logical assessment. That impulse is what I most need to experience directly. James stood very still, processing this completely unexpected turn of events. The commander who'd publicly rebuked him hours ago was now asking for intimate access to his emotional state, admitting that she needed to understand the very thing her culture taught was weakness. What exactly would this process involve? Sustained physical contact, primarily through the hands where the empathic receptors are most concentrated. Mental openness to allow the emotional transfer. It is not mind reading, she added quickly, seeing his expression shift. I will not access your thoughts or memories, only your emotional states as you experience them in the present moment. The process requires trust from both participants and can be emotionally intense, but it is not dangerous. How long would this take? As long as necessary to gather sufficient data. Perhaps an hour, possibly more if the connection proves productive. James considered refusing. This was far outside any protocol, far beyond what he'd signed up for when joining the Meridian's crew. And there was the not small matter of Vera's anger earlier. Did he really want to give someone who'd publicly humiliated him access to his emotional state? But looking at her now, James saw something he'd never noticed before in his limited interactions with Kyrath. Genuine vulnerability beneath the controlled exterior. She was asking for something that clearly cost her to request, admitting that her culture's approach had limitations, trusting him with research that was apparently personally important. And if he was honest with himself, he was curious, both about what she'd experienced and what it meant that she cared enough about understanding humans to request something her culture normally avoided. I have conditions, James said, making the decision as he spoke. If either of us becomes uncomfortable at any point, we stop immediately. No questions, no judgment. This remains completely confidential between us. I don't want this becoming crew gossip. And you have to explain what you're experiencing, so I understand what's happening from your perspective. I'm not going to be a passive subject in your experiment. Vera's ears tilted forward slightly, a position he thought might indicate approval or respect. Those conditions are acceptable. I agree to all of them. Then yes, I'll participate. Something shifted in Vera's posture, not quite relaxation, but a release of tension she'd been holding. "Thank you, Lieutenant. Your cooperation is appreciated and will contribute to better understanding between our species." She gestured toward a low table with cushions arranged on either side, clearly prepared for this purpose. James moved to sit, settling himself cross-legged on one cushion while Vera took the opposite position. They were closer than Kyrath normally tolerated being to other species. He could have reached out and touched her easily, their knees almost touching across the table's narrow surface. Vera extended her hands slowly, palms up, laying them on the table between them. Her hands were larger than his, with longer fingers and subtle markings on the palms that might have been the empathic receptors she'd mentioned. James hesitated for just a moment, then placed his hands in hers, feeling the warmth of her skin, the controlled strength in her grip. She could break his hands easily if she chose, but her touch was carefully measured, firm but not threatening. "I will initiate the connection now. You may feel unusual sensations, tingling, warmth, a sense of presence. These are normal. Try to remain mentally open and do not suppress your natural emotional responses." James nodded, not trusting his voice. Vera closed her eyes, her ears tilting slightly as she concentrated. James felt it begin, a strange tingling sensation spreading from where their skin connected, like electricity but not painful, more like awareness extending beyond his normal boundaries. The tingling intensified, spreading up his arms, and then suddenly Vera's eyes snapped open wide and she gasped, the first truly uncontrolled reaction he'd seen from her. Her grip on his hands tightened involuntarily, not painfully but with startled strength. Her breathing quickened, her ears tilting rapidly through several positions that suggested confusion and something like shock. James started to ask if she was okay, but she shook her head sharply, clearly trying to process something overwhelming. "This is..." Vera's voice was strained, lacking its usual precise control. "I did not expect. There is so much." James tried to understand what she was experiencing. To him, his internal state felt normal, the usual background noise of various minor emotions, curiosity about this situation, residual anxiety from earlier baseline contentment from being off-duty. Nothing particularly intense or unusual. But watching Vera's reaction, he realized that what felt normal to him must be overwhelming chaos to someone whose culture spent their entire lives suppressing emotional experience. "What are you feeling?" James asked, keeping his voice gentle. "Everything, simultaneously. How do you function like this?" Vera's eyes were still wide, her controlled composure thoroughly cracked. "There are at least 6 distinct emotional states present at once, all active, all competing for attention, and beneath them more like layers extending downward infinitely. I cannot." She paused, clearly struggling to articulate. "Kyrath consciousness is quiet, ordered, emotions exist but distant, controlled. This is..." "Chaos?" James suggested. "Yes, but not disordered. There is structure, but it moves, shifts constantly. And you simply exist in this state without effort. This is normal for humans. We're always feeling multiple things at once. It's just how we work." Vera was quiet for a moment, her eyes closing again as she focused on the connection. James could feel her presence now, a strange awareness at the edge of his consciousness, like someone standing just behind him where he couldn't quite see. It wasn't invasive exactly, but definitely intimate in a way that made him suddenly self-conscious about what he was feeling. He tried to focus on calming thoughts, but that immediately backfired. Attempting to suppress emotions just made them more present, and he felt embarrassment spike as he became aware that Vera could sense his self-consciousness, which made him more self-conscious, which intensified the emotion, creating a feedback loop that probably wasn't helpful for research purposes. "Stop that," Vera said, her voice slightly stronger now. "You are trying to control your emotional state for my benefit. Do not. I need to experience your natural processing, not a performance." James forced himself to relax, to simply feel whatever he felt without trying to manage it. His embarrassment about the earlier incident surfaced immediately. He'd been trying not to think about it, but now it was there, a warm flush of social discomfort mixed with regret and frustrated confusion about cultural protocols. Alongside it, genuine concern for Vera's well-being, both from earlier when he'd reached out to steady her and now during this experiment. Curiosity about what she was experiencing, slight anxiety about whether this was appropriate. And beneath all of it, a kind of baseline contentment that came from being off-duty and engaged in something interesting rather than routine. "I feel your embarrassment," Vera said, her voice taking on a slightly wondering quality. "It is. Not what I expected, not paralysis or weakness. It is information. Your emotion is telling you that you violated my boundaries, pushing you toward corrective behavior. It is functional, not dysfunctional." "That's exactly what it is," James confirmed, surprised by her insight. "Emotions give us information about social situations, about what's important, about what needs attention. We don't control them so much as learn from them. This is not what Kirath teaching says about emotions. We are taught that feelings are primitive responses to be suppressed through discipline, that they interfere with rational thought. They can interfere if they're too intense, but mostly they work alongside rational thought, giving us data that logic alone can't provide. Social dynamics, threat assessment, personal values, emotions process that information faster than conscious thought." Vera was quiet again, and James felt her attention shifting through his emotional landscape, examining different aspects. It was strange being observed like this from the inside, but not as uncomfortable as he'd expected. If anything, there was something validating about being truly understood, having someone perceive his internal experience directly rather than trying to explain it through the always inadequate medium of language. "Your concern for my safety is present again," Vera observed. "Not as intense as during the gravity failure, but constant. Why? I am not in danger currently." James considered the question. "Because you're participating in an experiment that makes you uncomfortable, and I care about your well-being. It's not logical concern about physical danger. It's emotional concern about a person I'm working with. But we barely know each other. We have had minimal interaction before today. Doesn't matter. You're a person, you're my crewmate, you're doing something difficult. That's enough for humans to feel concern." There was a long pause, and James sensed something shift in Vera's presence in his mind. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of something she hadn't understood before. "This is why you reached for me during the gravity failure." "Yes." It was not logical. You could not have calculated the trajectories, could not have known whether intervention was necessary. You simply acted on emotional impulse to prevent potential harm. That's how humans work in emergencies. We act on instinct first, analyze later. The instinct comes from emotions, fear, protectiveness, concern. Those emotions evolved to keep us alive and keep our social groups intact. And I interpreted your instinct to protect as an assault on my autonomy. Vera's voice carried something James had never heard from a Kirath before: regret. "I was wrong. Not about my culture's protocols, those are real and meaningful, but about what your actions signified." James felt a wash of relief that he hadn't realized he'd been holding back. Vera must have sensed it through their connection because she added, "I feel that. Your relief. It is significant to you that I understand your intention, even though my public rebuke still stands as cultural fact." "Of course it's significant. I didn't want you thinking I was trying to insult you or establish dominance, or whatever the cultural violation actually meant in Kirath terms. The violation meant you presumed I could not manage my own physical trajectory, that I required outside intervention due to my own incompetence. It is an insult to suggest a Kirath warrior cannot control their own body, but you were about to hit the weapons rack. Perhaps, or perhaps I would have corrected my trajectory at the last moment. You did not allow me the opportunity to demonstrate my competence." James processed this, feeling the complexity of the situation. His instinct had been protective, hers had been offended, and both responses were valid within their respective cultural frameworks. "So what should I have done?" warned you verbally. "Yes. Give me information and trust that I will respond appropriately. If I fail to respond, then physical intervention becomes justified. But your first move should honor my autonomy." "That makes sense. I'll remember that." They continued the experiment for another hour, with James deliberately moving through different emotional states while Vera experienced them through their empathic connection and asked questions to better understand what she was perceiving. He thought about his family back on Earth, bringing up love and longing, complex emotions that Vera found fascinating because they combined pleasure and pain simultaneously in ways that Kyrath emotional discipline wouldn't permit. He recalled a combat situation from his early military service, accessing controlled fear and determination, and Vera experienced how humans use fear as information and motivation rather than simply suppressing it. He even tried humor. It wasn't quite a dismissal, but James recognized the need for solitude. He stood, his legs slightly unsteady from sitting so long. "Commander, thank you for trusting me with this. I know it wasn't easy to ask." Vera's ears tilted forward slightly. "Thank you for agreeing despite my earlier treatment of you. I appreciate your willingness to assist me in understanding what I have spent my life believing was weakness." James left her quarters, stepping into the quiet corridor outside, and found himself needing a moment just to breathe. The empathic connection had been intense in ways he hadn't expected, and he felt strangely exposed, like someone had seen parts of him that he didn't usually share. But there was also something satisfying about being truly understood, about having someone experience his internal landscape directly rather than filtering it through inadequate explanations. As he walked back to his own quarters, James thought about Vera standing alone in her spare, controlled space, processing the chaotic emotional richness of human consciousness for the first time. He wondered what it meant that she'd asked for this, what she'd do with what she'd learned, and whether their relationship, if it could be called that after one intense evening, had fundamentally changed. He suspected tomorrow would bring answers to at least some of those questions. For now, he was exhausted, emotionally drained in a way that physical exercise never achieved, and ready for sleep that would probably be full of strange dreams about empathic connections and the space between species. In her quarters, Vera stood motionless at her viewport, staring at the stars without really seeing them, her hands still tingling with residual sensation from the empathic contact. She had conducted this experiment expecting data, clinical information about human emotional processing that would satisfy her intellectual curiosity and perhaps improve interspecies cooperation. What she had received instead was something far more unsettling, the direct experience of what she had been taught her entire life to suppress and dismiss as weakness. And it hadn't felt weak. It had felt profound, complex, deeply functional in ways that Kyrath emotional discipline never acknowledged. For the first time in her life, Commander Vera questioned whether her culture's approach to emotions was superior, or if it was simply different, with costs and benefits her people refused to examine. The thought was heresy. It was also undeniable. She would need to speak with James again. Soon. Because she had questions now that couldn't be answered through a single evening of empathic connection, questions that challenged the foundation of everything she'd believed about strength, control, and what it meant to be functional. But for tonight, she simply stood in the darkness of her quarters, feeling the echoes of emotions that weren't hers but which she'd experienced as intimately as her own heartbeat, and wondered what it meant that she wanted to feel them again. James woke the next morning half convinced the previous evening had been an elaborate stress dream, but the lingering sense memory of Vera's presence in his mind confirmed it had been real. He went through his morning routine on autopilot, shower, uniform, terrible coffee from his quarters dispenser that was somehow even worse than the mess hall's version. While trying to process what had happened and what it meant for his working relationship with the Kyrath commander. His shift started normally enough. Morning briefing, status updates, routine systems checks. Several crew members who'd witnessed yesterday's incident gave him curious looks, clearly wondering if there had been formal repercussions, but no one asked directly. James went about his duties with professional focus, managing tactical displays and coordinating security protocol with the various species representatives. He was reviewing the rotation schedule for the midday watch when his console chimed with an incoming private message. From Commander Vera, Lieutenant Kavak, I request your presence for continued research sessions. If you remain willing to participate, report to my quarters at 2100 hours tonight. We have much to discuss regarding yesterday's findings. The message was formal, almost identical in structure to yesterday's summons, but James noticed the subtle difference. Request, instead of the command phrasing she'd used before, and the acknowledgement that his willingness was a factor rather than an assumed given. He sent back a simple confirmation, then returned to his work, trying to ignore the mix of curiosity and nervousness settling in his chest. The day passed with the usual rhythm of shipboard life. The Meridian was currently in transit between star systems, conducting long-range scans and routine maintenance during the relatively calm journey. James handled a minor dispute between human and Tellarian crew members about proper procedure for equipment storage, reviewed security footage from the recreation areas, and tried very hard not to think too much about the evening's planned session. He did, however, spend his lunch break researching Kyrath emotional discipline in more detail, trying to better understand what Vera had been trained to suppress, and what yesterday's experience might have meant from her perspective. What he found was fascinating and slightly disturbing. Kyrath culture didn't just teach emotional control. It was fundamentally structured around the belief that emotions were evolutionary artifacts from their species' primitive past, dangerous impulses that had to be systematically trained out of individuals to create a functional society. Kyrath children underwent intensive discipline training from early age, learning to identify emotional responses, categorize them, and channel them into approved outlets before dismissing them completely. Adults who failed to maintain adequate emotional control faced social consequences ranging from loss of status to exile from Kyrath communities. The entire culture was built on the premise that feelings made individuals weak, unreliable, and potentially dangerous to social order. Reading this, James better understood Vera's reaction to experiencing his emotional landscape. She'd been directly confronting everything her culture taught was wrong and destructive, and instead of finding chaos and dysfunction, she discovered complexity and functionality. That had to be profoundly disorienting. At 20:55, James made his way to Vera's quarters, arriving with the same punctuality as before. The door opened immediately at his approach, and Vera stood waiting, dressed in the same casual but disciplined clothing as yesterday. Her expression was controlled, but James noticed her ears were tilted forward in a position he was beginning to recognize meant focused attention or anticipation. "Lieutenant, thank you for returning." She stepped aside to let him enter, and the door sealed behind him. "I have spent the day processing yesterday's experience. I have questions and would like to continue the empathic exchange if you are still willing." "I am," James said, moving to take the same position at the low table as before. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious about what you learned. You seemed pretty overwhelmed by the end." Vera settled across from him, her movements precise and controlled. "I was overwhelmed. I have spent 37 years of my life maintaining emotional discipline, suppressing feelings as they arise, channeling them only into approved purposes. Experiencing your emotional state, the constant flux, the multiple simultaneous emotions, the way feelings inform your decisions without controlling them, it contradicted everything I have been taught about how consciousness should function." "But," James prompted, hearing the implied continuation. But it worked. Your emotional processing is not chaos despite its complexity. It is a sophisticated parallel system running alongside rational thought, providing data and motivation that logic alone cannot generate. I saw this clearly through our connection, and it has caused me to question fundamental assumptions about Kyrath's superiority in emotional discipline. She extended her hands across the table, and James placed his in hers, feeling the now familiar warmth of her skin. The empathic connection opened more smoothly this time, perhaps because both of them knew what to expect. James felt Vera's presence in his mind, that sense of being observed from within, and deliberately relaxed into his natural emotional state rather than trying to control it. "Today I want to understand specific emotions more deeply," Vera said, her eyes closed in concentration. "Yesterday you mentioned that humans experience loneliness on long missions. I felt it present in your background emotional state, but I did not understand it. Can you focus on that feeling?" James thought about loneliness, not the acute version that came from isolation, but the chronic low-level ache of being far from family and familiar places. He thought about his sister Anna and her kids, about missing holidays and birthdays, about video messages that took days to arrive and never quite captured real conversation. He thought about Earth itself, the specific gravity and air and light that every human carried as a sense memory of home. Through the empathic connection, he felt Vera processing these emotions, trying to map them onto her own experience. "This is painful, but you do not suppress it. Why?" "Because suppressing it doesn't make it go away. It just makes me unable to acknowledge what I'm feeling. The loneliness tells me something important, that connections matter, that I value my relationships enough to miss them. Feeling it keeps me connected to what's important even when I'm far away. Kyrath do not experience this. We are trained to be complete unto ourselves, needing nothing from others beyond functional cooperation." "That sounds lonely too, just in a different way." Vera was quiet for a moment. "Perhaps. I do not have comparison, but through this connection I can feel what you mean, the desire for deep connection, the ache of its absence, the value you place on relationships that transcend functional purpose. Kyrath culture would call this dependency and weakness. Human culture calls it being alive and healthy. We're social creatures. We need connection to thrive, not just survive." They continued exploring different emotional states. Vera asked James to think about moments of joy, and he recalled swimming in Earth's oceans as a child, the physical pleasure of movement, the sensory richness, the uncomplicated happiness of being young and safe and engaged in pure play. Vera experienced this with what seemed like wonder, commenting that Kyrath had no equivalent to this kind of purposeless pleasure, that their culture considered joy only valid when earned through achievement or properly channeled discipline. She asked about fear, and James accessed memories of combat training, the controlled adrenaline rush of simulated danger. Vera felt how humans used fear as information and motivation rather than simply suppressing it, how the emotion sharpened focus and enhanced performance when properly managed. This aligned more closely with Kyrath teaching, fear as a tool, but James's approach was different. He didn't dismiss the fear after using it. He acknowledged it as a continuing presence that informed his decisions without paralyzing him. "You do not fight against your emotions," Vera observed. "You cooperate with them." "Exactly. They're part of me, not enemies to be defeated. Fighting them just wastes energy that could be used actually dealing with whatever situation triggered the emotion." This is a fundamental difference in philosophy. Kyrath teaching says emotions must be conquered, that allowing them to persist is failure of discipline. But you are suggesting that constant suppression is itself a waste of resources. Not just a waste. Suppressing emotions takes effort, creates stress, and cuts you off from important information. It's like trying to fly a ship with half your sensors offline. Technically possible, but why would you choose that? Vera's grip on his hands tightened slightly, and James felt something shift in her presence. Not the overwhelming shock of yesterday, but something more subtle. Uncertainty, maybe, or the beginning of doubt about beliefs she'd held her entire life. "I need to share something with you," Vera said, her voice carrying an unusual quality that James couldn't quite interpret. "Through our connection yesterday, I experienced your embarrassment about the gravity incident. I felt your genuine distress at having offended me, your concern for my dignity, your desire to correct the situation. These were not markers of weakness or social incompetence. They were signs of a functioning empathic awareness that Kyrath achieved through rigid protocol rather than emotional sensitivity." "I'm not sure I follow." "Kyrath maintains social cohesion through elaborate rules about appropriate behavior. We do not violate each other's boundaries because we have been taught precise protocols, not because we intuitively sense discomfort. Your embarrassment served the same function as our protocols. It told you that you had crossed a boundary and motivated you to correct course. But your system is internal and automatic, while ours is external and learned." James considered this. "So you're saying humans use emotions as an internal social navigation system, while Kyrath use external rules?" "Yes, and I am realizing that perhaps neither system is superior. They are simply different approaches to the same problem of maintaining functional social groups." Vera paused. "I'm also realizing that my anger at you yesterday was partially defensive. Your instinctive concern for my safety triggered an emotional response in me that I immediately suppressed, but which left me unsettled. I did not understand what I was feeling, only that your action had caused me to feel something I was trained not to acknowledge." "What were you feeling?" Vera was quiet for so long that James wondered if she would answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Gratitude, and something like warmth. That someone would act without calculation to ensure my safety, that my well-being mattered to a near stranger simply because we share crew status. Kyrath culture has no framework for such casual kindness. We earn respect through achievement, maintain relationships through mutual benefit, but this instinctive care for others' welfare without expectation of return. We do not do this." "You're saying Kyrath culture doesn't have compassion?" "We have duty. We have loyalty to those who have earned it. We have strategic cooperation with allies, but compassion without purpose or expectation. That is considered irrational emotional excess." Vera's eyes opened, meeting his directly. "Experiencing it from inside your consciousness, feeling your genuine concern for someone you barely know simply because I am a person who might be hurt, that was profound in ways I am still processing." James felt something shift in his own emotional landscape. Sympathy for Vera, realizing she'd spent her entire life in a culture that trained away one of the fundamental aspects of social consciousness that humans took for granted. "That sounds incredibly lonely." I did not think of it that way. But yes, perhaps it is lonely. I would not know because I have never experienced the alternative until now." They sat in connected silence for a while, both processing the weight of what was being acknowledged. James felt Vera's presence in his mind, exploring his reactions, feeling his sympathy and lack of judgment, his genuine interest in understanding her experience. Through their connection, he could sense something from her side too, not her emotions exactly, but the echo of them, strictly controlled but present nonetheless. Curiosity, certainly, and something that might have been gratitude or trust, though filtered through so many layers of discipline that it was nearly unrecognizable. "I want to share my emotional state with you again," Vera said, "so you can understand what I experienced during yesterday's session and what I am processing now." "I'd like that," James agreed. The empathic connection reversed, and James experienced Kyrath consciousness for the second time. It was like stepping from a busy marketplace into a cathedral, vast, quiet, ordered. Emotions existed in this space but distantly, like echoes from far away. He felt Vera acknowledge a flicker of curiosity, categorize it, channel it into focused attention, then dismiss the emotional component while retaining only the functional drive to acquire information. The entire process took maybe 2 seconds and was so automatic she probably didn't consciously notice doing it. But James also felt something new this time. Tiny cracks in the discipline, moments where emotions weren't completely dismissed, where feelings lingered at the edges of consciousness despite training. Vera was aware of these cracks, and he felt her concern, quickly suppressed, that her emotional control was degrading after exposure to human consciousness. When they broke the connection, James took a moment to readjust to his own normal emotional complexity after experiencing Kyrath's silence. You're worried that experiencing human emotions is affecting your own discipline. Vera's ears tilted back slightly. Discomfort or embarrassment, he thought. Yes, I find myself noticing feelings that I would normally suppress without conscious attention. Yesterday, during my duty shift, I felt satisfaction at completing a task efficiently. That should have been dismissed immediately. Instead, I allowed it to persist for several seconds, simply experiencing the pleasant sensation. That is a failure of discipline by Kyrath standards. Or it's learning that emotions don't have to be enemies, James suggested gently. Maybe experiencing them doesn't make you weaker or less effective. Maybe it just makes you more complete. That is heresy against fundamental Kyrath teaching. Is it wrong, though? Vera stood abruptly, moving to her viewport with that characteristic need for space when processing difficult concepts. James remained seated, giving her room. After a long moment, she spoke without turning around. I do not know. 3 days ago, I would have said absolutely yes, that emotional indulgence leads to chaos and dysfunction. Now I have experienced human emotional consciousness directly, have felt its complexity and functionality, and I cannot maintain that absolute certainty. She turned to face him. You have disrupted my worldview, Lieutenant. I am not certain whether to thank you or resent you for it. You asked for this, James pointed out. You sought understanding. I sought data. I received something far more challenging. She moved back to the table but remained standing. I want to continue these sessions. Not daily. I need time to process between experiences, but regularly. Is that acceptable to you? Yes, James said without hesitation. I'm learning things too, about how different species process the same underlying realities. It's fascinating from a human perspective. Then we will meet again in 3 days, same time. Between now and then, I would appreciate if you did not discuss these sessions with other crew members. Not from shame, she added quickly, seeing his expression, but because I need to work through these questions privately before facing potential judgment from my own people. Of course, this stays between us. James left her quarters a short time later, his mind full of the evening's conversations and revelations. As he walked back to his own quarters through the Meridian's quiet corridors, he thought about empathy and understanding, about the vast distances between species that could sometimes be bridged through direct experience, and about a Kyrath commander whose carefully maintained worldview was beginning to crack around the edges. Behind him, in her spare quarters, Vera stood motionless and allowed herself to feel something she would normally suppress immediately. Hope that these sessions would continue, that this strange connection with a human who saw her emotions as valuable rather than problematic might lead somewhere unexpected. She acknowledged the hope, let it persist for a full 10 seconds, and only then, with conscious effort, dismissed it into the disciplined silence that Kyrath consciousness demanded. But it had been there. She had felt it. And that mattered in ways she was only beginning to understand. The sessions continued over the following weeks, falling into a rhythm that felt both routine and profound. Every 3 or 4 days, James would report to Vera's quarters at 2100 hours. They would engage in empathic connection for an hour or more, and both would leave changed in ways that were difficult to articulate. The crew noticed nothing unusual. Their professional interactions remained correct. Training progress. The joy had been quickly suppressed as inappropriate emotional indulgence, but the memory remained. Through their reversed connection, James experienced what Kyrath consciousness had been before discipline training. Messier than adult Kyrath emotional silence, but still more controlled than human baseline. He felt the moment when young Vera had recognized the joy, felt the fear that came with it, fear of being undisciplined, fear of disappointing her teachers, and then the systematic suppression as she applied the training that would eventually become automatic. "You learn to be afraid of your own feelings," James said after they broke the connection. "Kyrath culture doesn't just teach discipline, it makes emotions themselves threatening." "That is the purpose," Vera replied. "Emotions are threatening. They can lead to impulsive action, poor judgment, social chaos. They can also lead to innovation, compassion, and the kind of deep connections that make life meaningful. You're not wrong that emotions can be dangerous if unmanaged. But Kyrath teaching goes too far in the other direction." Vera was quiet, her ears tilted in that position James now recognized as deep contemplation. "I am beginning to agree with you. But that agreement comes with profound implications I am not prepared to face yet." Their 9th session marked a turning point. Vera arrived at their scheduled meeting time clearly distressed. Her ears were tilted back, her movements less controlled than usual, and James noticed her hands were trembling slightly before she clasped them behind her back. "What happened?" he asked immediately, concern overriding protocol. "I have made an error," Vera said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Or perhaps not an error but a choice that will have consequences I did not anticipate." She explained that during a department meeting earlier that day, one of her junior officers, a young Kyrath named Tersh who was struggling with the stress of first deep space assignment, had made a tactical error in presenting a security assessment. The mistake was minor but embarrassing, and by Kyrath protocol, Tersh should have been formally corrected in front of the assembled officers to reinforce proper procedure. Instead, Vera had found herself responding with compassion, recognizing Tersh's stress, understanding the emotional pressure driving the error, and choosing to address the mistake privately after the meeting rather than public correction. She'd even expressed understanding of the challenges Tersh was facing, offered support, and suggested strategies for managing assignment stress. "This was inappropriate by Kyrath standards," Vera continued. "Public correction serves a purpose. It reinforces standards and demonstrates impartial leadership. My private approach was emotional indulgence that could be interpreted as favoritism or weak leadership. Or it could be interpreted as compassionate leadership that recognizes individual circumstances while still maintaining standards," James countered. What was Tersh's reaction? Gratitude and confusion. He did not understand why I would show concern for his emotional state rather than simply correcting his error. Vera moved to her meditation space, sitting on the mat with rigid posture. "But James, I did it because of our sessions. Because I have learned from experiencing your emotions that compassion is not weakness, that understanding others' internal states improves rather than undermines effective leadership. I have allowed human emotional processing to influence my Kyrath command decisions." James sat across from her, recognizing the crisis this represented. "You think you've compromised your integrity as a Kyrath officer?" "Yes and no. I am confused, which itself is unfamiliar. Kyrath certainty has been compromised by human emotional complexity, and I do not know if this is growth or corruption of my cultural identity. Can I offer a perspective?" Vera's ears tilted forward slightly, listening. "You haven't stopped being Kyrath," James said carefully. "You've added to your capabilities without subtracting from them. You still have your discipline, your training, your cultural strengths. But now you also have expanded understanding of emotional dynamics that makes you more effective at leading a multi-species crew. That's not corruption, that's evolution. Kyrath culture does not value evolution of this kind. We value perfection of what we already are, not transformation into something different. Then maybe Kyrath culture has limitations worth examining. Maybe the reason you volunteered for this research in the first place is because part of you suspected there were things about emotions your culture wasn't acknowledging. Vera was very still, and James recognized he'd touched something profound. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. When I was young, before full discipline training, I asked my mother why we had to suppress feelings if they were simply going to arise again. She told me that was proof emotions were flaws to be corrected through discipline. But I wondered, if feelings keep arising despite suppression, perhaps they are not flaws but essential aspects of consciousness that we are training away rather than training to use properly. You've been questioning Kyrath, teaching about emotions your entire life. Yes, but questioning and acting on that questioning are different things. These sessions with you have moved me from intellectual curiosity to lived experience that contradicts my culture's fundamental assumptions. I do not know what to do with that. James extended his hands across the space between them. Maybe tonight we don't do the empathic connection. Maybe tonight we just talk, as people trying to figure out difficult truths together. Vera looked at his offered hands for a long moment, then reached out and clasped them without initiating the empathic link. Just physical contact, human and Kyrath hands joined across species and cultural differences. I appreciate this, James, more than I can adequately express through words. You have given me something I did not know I needed, permission to question what I have been taught without judgment or expectation that I will abandon my culture entirely. You don't have to abandon your culture. You just have to decide which parts serve you and which parts limit you unnecessarily. They talked for hours that night. No empathic connection, just conversation between two people navigating the complicated space between cultural identity and personal growth. Vera described Kyrath society in more detail than she ever had before, the beauty of their discipline and achievements, but also the costs. Kyrath who failed to maintain adequate emotional control and were exiled. The impossibility of certain kinds of intimate connections when everyone was trained to be completely self-sufficient. The way strict emotional discipline sometimes prevented creative problem-solving that required intuitive leaps. James talked about human emotional struggles. The way unmanaged feelings could indeed lead to poor decisions. The existence of human cultures that had toxic relationship patterns precisely because emotions were allowed to run without healthy boundaries. The fact that not every emotional impulse should be acted upon. He acknowledged that Kyrath's concern about undisciplined emotions wasn't entirely wrong. Emotions needed to be understood and managed, just not suppressed to the point of elimination. Perhaps what I am learning, Vera said as their session was ending, is that there is a middle path between Kyrath suppression and human free expression. Not abandoning discipline but applying it more selectively. Not eliminating emotions, but channeling them toward useful purposes while still allowing their information and motivation to be felt. That sounds like wisdom, James agreed. And it sounds like something that could benefit both our species if you can figure out how to teach it. Vera's ears did that flutter of pleased recognition. You think this research has applications beyond my personal growth? Absolutely. Imagine Kyrath officers who maintained their incredible discipline and combat effectiveness, but also had access to emotional intelligence that improved team cohesion and cross-species cooperation. Or imagine humans learning some Kyrath techniques for managing overwhelming emotions in crisis situations without completely suppressing their humanity. There's potential here for both species to learn from each other. That would require me to formalize findings and present them to Kyrath leadership, which would require admitting I have been deliberately experiencing emotional states that our culture considers inappropriate. That would take courage, James acknowledged, or foolishness. But Vera smiled slightly, A real smile, not just the careful neutrality that usually passed for Kyrath positive expression. Though I am learning from you that courage and foolishness are sometimes the same thing, distinguished only by outcome and interpretation. Their sessions continued with new depth after that night. Vera began to selectively integrate emotional awareness into her daily life, noticing feelings without immediately suppressing them, using emotional information to supplement her tactical and strategic thinking. She reported that her command effectiveness was improving. Her multi-species security teams responded better to leadership that acknowledged stress and morale as factors in performance. And her human subordinates in particular seemed more loyal and engaged when their commander demonstrated understanding of emotional dynamics. But Vera also faced growing internal conflict. The more she learned about and experienced emotional consciousness, the harder it became to maintain the strict Kyrath discipline she'd been trained to embody. She felt like she was living in two worlds simultaneously. The Kyrath world of disciplined emotional silence and the human world of acknowledged feelings, and wasn't entirely comfortable in either anymore. During their 14th session, Vera admitted something that clearly cost her to say aloud. I am beginning to care about you, James, not in professional respect or functional cooperation sense. I mean that your well-being matters to me beyond strategic or duty considerations. When you mentioned that your sister's child was born last week and you couldn't be there, I felt sadness for your loss of that moment. I did not suppress it immediately. I let myself feel concern for your emotional pain, and I wanted to offer comfort, though I have no framework for how to do so. James felt his heart rate increase. This was far more personal than their previous discussions had ventured. That's called friendship, Vera, or maybe the beginning of it. Caring about someone beyond what they can do for you, wanting their happiness even when it doesn't benefit you. Humans do this naturally, but for you, choosing to feel that despite your training, that's remarkable. It is also terrifying. Kyrath teaching says emotional bonds create vulnerability, dependencies that can be exploited. By allowing myself to care about your well-being, I have created a weakness in my otherwise disciplined consciousness. Or you've created a strength. People you care about become worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth the effort of being your best self. Human teams perform better when they have genuine emotional bonds, not just professional cooperation. I know this intellectually now. Feeling it directly is different. Vera's hands tightened around his, though the empathic connection wasn't active. I do not know what to do with these feelings. I cannot dismiss them as I was trained, but I am also not human enough to simply accept them as natural and appropriate. You don't have to be human. You can be Kyrath, who's learning that your culture's teaching about emotions isn't the only valid approach. You can integrate what you're learning with what you already are. That is what I am attempting. But James, you should know, if my people learn what I have been doing, the extent to which I have allowed emotional indulgence to influence my behavior, there will be consequences. At minimum, loss of command. Possibly exile from Kyrath society for insufficient discipline. James felt a spike of concern. Then maybe we should stop the sessions. I don't want you to lose everything because of research I agreed to participate in. No. Vera's voice was firm, her ears forward with determination. I do not want to stop. What I am learning matters more than maintaining perfect adherence to cultural expectations that I increasingly believe are flawed. If I must choose between Kyrath approval and this expanded understanding of consciousness, I choose understanding. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of that declaration settling between them. Vera had just chosen personal growth and truth over cultural conformity, and they both understood the magnitude of that decision. Then we continue, James said, but carefully. We document the research properly, build a case for its value, and when the time comes to present findings, we do it in a way that emphasizes benefits to both species rather than framing it as rejection of Kyrath teaching. You would help me with this, even though it is my research and my cultural conflict. We're friends, remember, or at least that's what you just admitted to feeling. Friends help each other through difficult things. Vera's expression softened in a way that James had never seen in a Kyrath before, open, vulnerable, genuinely moved. Yes, we are friends. Thank you, James, for helping me understand what that means. The next weeks brought both growth and complications. Vera's command style continued evolving, incorporating emotional intelligence while maintaining Kyrath effectiveness. Her security department's performance metrics actually improved, particularly in scenarios requiring cross-species coordination or creative problem-solving under pressure. She began documenting these improvements carefully, building evidence that emotional awareness enhanced rather than compromised Kyrath capabilities. But the changes in her behavior didn't go unnoticed. Several Kyrath crew members expressed concern through formal channels that Commander Vera was displaying insufficient emotional discipline. She'd been observed offering encouragement to struggling subordinates, expressing satisfaction at team successes, even showing what appeared to be personal concern rather than purely professional interest in crew welfare. By Kyrath standards, these were all signs of degraded discipline. The situation came to a head when Commander Theron, a senior Kyrath officer from the Science Division, requested a formal meeting with Vera. James learned about it when Vera sent him a terse message. Theron has questions about my emotional discipline. May become complicated. Will contact you after. James spent his shift anxious and distracted, wondering what complicated meant, and whether their research sessions were about to become public in ways that would damage Vera's career. When she finally contacted him that evening, requesting he come to her quarters immediately, he practically ran through the corridors. He found her standing at her viewport, posture rigid with tension. Theron confronted me about emotional indulgence. He has been observing my command decisions and believes I am failing to maintain adequate discipline. He has filed formal concern with the Kyrath leadership liaison aboard the Meridian. What does that mean? It means my emotional control will be evaluated according to Kyrath standards. If I am found to have insufficient discipline, I will be removed from command and likely recalled to Kyrath homeworld for retraining or exile. Vera turned to face him, and James saw something he'd never expected to see in a Kyrath: visible fear. I told him the truth, about our research sessions, about deliberately experiencing human emotions, about learning that Kyrath teaching might be incomplete. He was appalled. Vera, I'm so sorry, this is my fault. No, she cut him off firmly. This is my choice. I knew the risks. I chose to continue despite them because what we were learning mattered more than maintaining perfect cultural conformity. She moved closer to him, her voice dropping. But James, I need you to understand something. If the evaluation goes poorly, if I am exiled from Kyrath society, I will have no people, no culture, no home. I will be functionally alone in the galaxy, neither Kyrath nor capable of becoming human. James felt his chest tighten with sympathetic fear for her. We won't let that happen. We'll present the research, show the benefits. Kyrath leadership may not care about benefits if they believe fundamental discipline has been compromised. But I will try. I have to try. Because the alternative is pretending the past months never happened, suppressing everything I've learned, returning to emotional silence that now feels like living death. James reached out and took her hands, not for empathic connection, just for physical comfort and support. Then we fight for this. We show them that what you've discovered isn't corruption but evolution. That Kyrath can maintain their strengths while adding new capabilities. And if they won't listen, he paused, not sure if he should say what he was thinking. Say it, Vera prompted. If they won't listen and if the worst happens, you won't be alone. You'll have friends. Human friends, multi-species friends, people who value who you're becoming even if your own culture can't. Something shifted in Vera's expression. Surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that James couldn't quite name. You would offer me a place in your social group even if my own people exile me. Of course, that's what friends do. Vera pulled him into an embrace that was awkward and unpracticed. Kyrath didn't typically hug, but genuine. James felt her shaking slightly with suppressed emotion, and he held her carefully, offering what comfort he could to someone facing the potential loss of everything familiar. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me permission to feel what I feel, for showing me that emotions are not enemies to be defeated, for being my friend when my culture would say I should need no one." They stood like that for a long moment, two people from different species connected by something that transcended cultural boundaries. Genuine care, mutual respect, and the kind of deep understanding that came from literally sharing conscious experience. Whatever happened with the evaluation, whatever consequences came from their research, James knew this connection was real and valuable. And he suspected that even if Kyrath leadership couldn't see it, they had discovered something important about what was possible when different species chose to truly understand each other rather than simply coexisting in parallel. The evaluation was scheduled for the following week, and James found himself preparing alongside Vera, helping her compile evidence and formulate arguments. But beneath the practical preparation, both of them knew they were really fighting for something larger. The right to grow beyond cultural limitations, the validity of emotional consciousness as a sophisticated tool rather than primitive weakness, and the possibility that understanding between species could create something better than either culture alone. It was ambitious, possibly foolish, and absolutely worth fighting for. Just like friendship across impossible distances. Just like every worthwhile thing humans had ever attempted.